I'm going to tell the story of the first chapter of the book of Ruth through the eyes of Orpah, who was Ruth's sister-in-law, Naomi's daughter-in-law. Just so you know, the very famous person Oprah Winfrey, her name was actually a misspelling of Orpah from the book of Ruth. So that little fact you get for free. But anyway. The story before you is known as the book of Ruth. But before it was Ruth's story, it was the story of a family in distress. The family of Elimelek and Naomi and their sons Mahlon and Kilion. The story of this family begins at the end, or at least what most reasonable people would consider to be an ending. When Naomi talked about it, which she did not do often, but sometimes, when we had finished our chores for the evening and had a few moments before we were about to turn into bed, she might tell Ruth and I some stories about her life in her beloved homeland. And she would tell us how she had what most people would consider to be the good life. A husband, a family, 2 sons. It was the kind of life that I dreamed of as a girl too. But then without any warning, things began to change for this family. Slowly at first, and then at breakneck speed. And Naomi was left bereft and empty and without hope. It began for them in the lean years. The harvests weren't too good one year, and then the next they were worse, and the next worse still, and then they had little left to live on. And then famine. The word is so easy to ignore when you are well fed, but if you have ever experienced one, you would not pass that word by so quickly in a story. Instead, it would strike terror in your heart to even hear the word mentioned. It was not just that the crops weren't faring well, it was that no one in all of Bethlehem, a place which name ironically means the house of bread, no one had enough to eat, let alone any to sell to those fortunate few who had some sort of money or goods or land to barter with. There was none to find or buy or sell. Famine. It is horrible, and it numbs the soul. When you beg God for rain and see none fall from the sky for months that stretch to years, when you organize prayer services of people crying out for relief and see nothing in response, it is devastating. Just the rumors of this famine, when it reached our ears in Moab, it gave me nightmares when I was a girl. And this famine chased Naomi and her family from their home. Elimelek made the decision to leave Bethlehem and go somewhere where they might have even the possibility of finding work and food, a place where their sons wouldn't languish before their eyes. And on those nights, Naomi would sometimes even admit that while the famine raged and then drove them out of their homeland, the land that she loved, she would ask questions of God like, if God really loves us, she believed she was from the chosen people of God. If God loved us, could God have not prevented this from happening? I remember the first time I saw their family. They were foreigners in the market. They were trying to barter for some food to eat for supper that night. And I was just a small girl, and I saw a boy who was not much older than me, but he was kind of dressed strangely. And when he spoke, his accent was kind of funny. And when my mother caught me staring, she actually grabbed my hand and whisked me away, pulling me away from that foreign boy and his family. Little did I know that one day that strange boy would be my husband. And little did I, secure in my home and with my family, know that the only reason to uproot a family and to risk a perilous journey to a foreign country and to subject yourselves to parents pulling their curious kids away from you in the market, and to enduring what might even be outright hostility to outsiders who take up your precious resources, is because you saw no other choice. Not to mention that this family, and many others who showed up in our borders about this time, They were from Judah. There is little love lost between Moab and Judah. People from Judah thought that we Moabites were boorish and pagan and idolaters. I would come to learn, when I learned about their customs and worship from my husband and from my mother-in-law, that they forbade Ammonites and Moabites, such as Ruth and me, from worshiping in their temples for 10 generations. And I have to say, we in Moab, we looked down our noses at the Judeans too when they showed up on our borders. Naomi never really got over her longing for her real home, as she thought it, in Judah. But as she would say, Moab had food and Judah did not, and so they arrived in our town destitute and in search of a future. But although Moab did indeed have food, it was hardly the land of promise for this family. That public tragedy of the famine gave way to a personal tragedy when Elimelek died. Naomi was a widow now with 2 sons to look after. Statistics tell us that 90% of married women will have the experience of being a widow at some time in their lives. And it is difficult, even in your day and age. But when I was alive, being a widow was devastating. It left you without an attachment to a male in a world where men were everything. You might consider a widow in my day the way you might view homeless in yours. You feel sorry for those people, and you might give them the odd handout if you're feeling charitable, but what you really want to do is hurry past them and try to forget them once you've seen them. Now, it was slightly better if a widow had sons, because a son who was old enough could look after you. And thankfully, Naomi had 2 sons, so all was not lost for her. But not only was widowhood different in my day, so was marriage. Marriage was a union between 2 families, and it was usually undertaken to secure a social position. So if someone wanted to marry well, they had to give something to the other family. Now, Naomi, to her credit, did the best she could, considering that she and her 2 sons were refugees, and she didn't have a man to negotiate a good marriage for her sons. But there were a few families around, like mine, with more than enough daughters and little enough social capital, that Ruth and I both found ourselves bundled into this little household. Perhaps Moab was the place for this family after all. And Naomi wanted nothing more than to be a grandmother. She waited so eagerly for the babies that would grow our family. 2 sons and 2 new daughters-in-law? Oh, it should have happened quickly and easily. But month by month, year by year, neither Ruth nor I had an announcement that would light up her eyes, or our own, actually, because we desperately wanted to be mothers too. No matter how often we waited and wished, how often we prayed to her God and to ours, no matter how often we hoped, no matter how many of Naomi's home remedies or best advice we tried, nothing. My womb remained stubbornly empty. And after 10 years of this, we had given up hope. Naomi began to say that the family line of Elimelek would end here, a lonely widow in a foreign land with her sons and their foreign wives. And then, without warning, death struck again. This time, it took both Mahlon and Kilion, my husband and Ruth's, and both of Naomi's precious sons, one right after the other. And our household had shrunk to not just 1 widow and their 2 sons and their wives, but to 3 widows, unattached in a world where having a man in the family is everything. And one of those widows was long past her childbearing years, and the other 2 had been unable to conceive children despite a decade of trying. We were of no interest to anyone at all, truly at an end. What would become of a household like ours? On her worst days, Naomi would ask what hope there was for someone named Pleasant, for that's what her name, Naomi, means, when her life had been one bitter pill after another. She would say things like her story just might as well be over, that her life had no meaning and no purpose and no hope. And sometimes I would wonder if mine had any either. Maybe you know what that feels like. Maybe you know what it feels like to come up against something, a situation or a loss or a blow or a grief or a diagnosis or the ending of a relationship or having to declare bankruptcy or whatever it is, and you just can't imagine living beyond this point. What happens when the things we rely on in our lives, our relationships or our health, our strength, our prosperous career, the bank account we have amassed, what happens when those things are stripped away from us? Do we matter to anyone in the world when we have nothing but ourselves and our many needs? Do we matter to God? Where do we go when we are still alive, but we don't have any life left in us or anything to live for? Where do we go when it feels like our story is at the end? A modern-day man, Nicholas Wolsterhoff, wrote the following words after losing his 25-year-old son in a climbing accident. He wrote, "I am at an impasse, and you, God, have brought me here. From my earliest days, I believed in you. I shared in the life of your people, in their prayers and in their work and their songs. For me, your yoke was easy. On me, your presence smiled. Noon has darkened," he says, "and where are you in this darkness? Or is it not your absence in which I dwell, but your elusive, troubling presence?" As this writer has expressed, Naomi felt totally flattened by life. She was at the end of the road, there in a place that was home for me, but foreign to her. She would talk about the God she had worshiped and walked with for years, and she struggled mightily with her faith. Now, she never said that she didn't believe that Yahweh, that was her God, that Yahweh existed, but she couldn't believe that Yahweh was very good. She believed Yahweh had turned his hand against her and then his back on her. And with this kind of testimony, I admit that sometimes I hedged my bets. And when Ruth and Naomi would worship Yahweh in our household, I would sometimes whisper my own prayers to the deities that I had grown up worshiping in my home. Not that they helped much either when everything was taken from us. I remember the day that Ruth and I came home from selling some produce from our family garden in the market, and I saw the first glimmer of hope that I had seen in many years from my poor, worn-out mother-in-law. A rumor had reached her ears that the famine in her home, the house of bread, Bethlehem in Judah, was over. And she clung to this like a rope tossed to a drowning person. Almost immediately, she began to pack up her meager possessions, and she urged us to pack too. And Ruth and I, no questions asked, we did so. And I realized with some surprise how close the three of us had become, struggling together all those childless and tiresome years. And we set out with her, our broken-down mother-in-law, who had become a second mother to both of us, on the road to Bethlehem. And I didn't remember the last time I had seen such a skip in Naomi's step. She was going home. But after a day or so of travel, she began to slow down, and eventually she just stopped altogether. She said she had realized that while Bethlehem in Judah was home for her, it wasn't for Ruth and it wasn't for me. And if she dragged us there, then we would become what she had been all the time that I knew her, a stranger, a foreigner, living among people that you don't trust, forced to behave and speak and even worship in unfamiliar and sometimes hostile ways. Having lived it herself, she didn't want to do that to Ruth and to I. She told us that we had been more than daughters-in-law to her. We had become her friends. And if Naomi's prospects in Bethlehem were not that good, she told us that she pretty much wanted to go home to die among familiar faces, that she didn't want to give Moab the satisfaction of taking her too. Her prospects were not good, but ours were impossible. She could not give us new husbands in the way that her people had provided for their families for so many years, by bearing new sons for us to marry. And how could a poor widow ever get a reasonable match for two outsiders? At least Moab was home for us, so she urged us to go home to the house of our mothers, the houses we grew up in, for the sake of our own future. Oh, the tears. Ruth and I pleaded with her, and we held on to her, and we cried forever at the thought of watching Naomi, who'd become like a mother and a friend to us, the center of our home for so long, to watch her walk away and never to see her again. And she cried too. And I can see how much it hurt her to send us away. But she told us over and over again that it was because she cared so much for us that we needed to turn around and save ourselves. She urged us to go home. And after many more tears and emotional goodbyes, I turned around to do just that. And I expected my friend and companion, dear Ruth, to turn around and go with me. But she, that stubborn girl, she refused to leave Naomi's side. How silly can you be? No one in their right mind would throw their fortune in with Naomi. Just ask her. She would tell you that she was used up and worn out and maybe even cursed. But Ruth was apparently not in her right mind, and she refused to turn back. She hitched her wagon to the star of an old, broken-down, hopeless widow. Later, Naomi would tell me that she bound herself to Naomi with a beautiful oath. And in fact, some people still use it as a wedding vow in your day. But I wonder if the people who speak these words while wearing a white dress and standing between flowers and anticipating cake and pictures, smiles and a party, know that these words were spoken in the for poorer part of life. Ruth said to Naomi, "Don't force me to leave you. Don't make me go home. Where you go, I go. Where you live, I'll live. Your people are my people. Your God is my God. Where you die, I'll die, and that's where I'll be buried. So help me, God, not even death itself is going to come between us." Ruth gave Naomi everything she had. She gave Naomi her presence, her companionship, her Moabite nationality, but she also gave Naomi her future, her death, her burial. And to do this, Ruth was going to have to embrace a new religion and a new God, Yahweh, who, if you remember, Naomi felt had dealt very bitterly with her. And yet, against all sense and reason, Ruth embraced Yahweh at the same time as she embraced Naomi. And in so doing, she actually behaved very much like the God she had chosen to embrace and follow, a God who never leaves us nor forsakes us, who offers strong, unbreakable love. Even though Ruth grew up in a pagan country, worshiping the same deities that I worshiped, she showed Naomi the face of Yahweh that day. When Ruth wrote to me later of the journey to Bethlehem, she would tell me how quiet it was. Apparently shocked and undone that Ruth would do this, and I sure don't blame Naomi for feeling that way, because I thought so too. That Ruth would commit herself to Naomi, well, she had nothing left to say. Naomi simply picked up what little luggage she had with her and pressed on toward Bethlehem with an unexpected but determined companion. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, Ruth wrote, they were the talk of the town. It seems that hardly anyone recognized Naomi, who had set out with a family of 4, but who had returned to them after so many years, empty, destitute, bitter, hopeless, and alone. At least that's how she felt, but she wasn't really alone, because there was this person with her who had completed the silent journey and who had never left her side. Oddly enough, when you read this story in your day, often people say it's a romance or a love story. But there's only one time in the entire book of Ruth that the word love is mentioned, and it's at the end of the story, when the women of Bethlehem give voice to something that Naomi missed on that silent journey. At the end of the story, the women, those same women who hardly recognized Naomi when she turned up again, would sing a song about how much Ruth loved Naomi. Ruth was God's gift to her, even though she didn't have the eyes to see it right away. Have you ever seen a movie that felt like it had multiple endings? Naomi's story, Ruth's story, my story seems to abound in endings. Famine, forced migration, death of our spouses, of Naomi's sons, childlessness. These are all potential endings. But Henry Nouwen once wrote this: "The dance of life finds its beginning in grief. Here a completely new way of living is revealed. It is the way in which pain can be embraced, not out of a desire to suffer, but in the knowledge that something new will be born in the pain." And that's what happened in this story. All of those endings turned out not to be endings at all, as painful as they were. And as the story unfolds, you will notice that there was no great miracle. There was no rending of the heavens, no voices from the sky, nothing that would make it seem like the intervention of God was imminent. But God's fingerprints are all over this story. And the very first gift that God gave to Naomi in her grief was an ordinary person, someone that she and I had both known for years at this point, her own dear, if stubborn, Ruth. One person asks this: "I wonder if any of us truly grasps the power we have to rescue and bless the lives of others when we bear the name of Jesus and he is present with us." Through the love and self-sacrifice of Ruth, Naomi learned a little something about the love and care of God, which is in fact something that we get to discover when we encounter the love of Jesus, who also loved us and gave himself up for us. And at the table of the Lord, which is set before us, that is where we fully observe that love and that grace and the presence of Jesus, who is always with us. Would you bow with me in a word of prayer? Dear God, sometimes it seems as if life deals us bitter blows. And sometimes we wonder if you even care about the things that are happening to us. But even in these times of difficulty, help us to remember that with you, there can always be new birth, new life, a new place to start. May we learn to dust our lives for your fingerprints and enable us to see the ways that you care for us, even when it's something so ordinary as the love and support of another person, or through the old story of how Jesus Christ, the author and perfecter of our faith, who endured the cross, scorning its shame, shows us God's love to the world and to each one of us. Amen.